Okay, welcome everyone. Sorry we're running a few minutes late, but thank you for coming out tonight, and thank you for those of you that are joining over the internet as well. My name is Martin Williams. I'm an associate professor here at the school, and it's my pleasure tonight to welcome Mihály Fazekas to the school. Mishi's a postdoc at Cambridge, where he leads the DIGIWHIST project on corruption and procurement and big data. And he also runs a think tank based in Budapest, Hungary, focused on anti-corruption kind of activities. Mihály is here tonight under the auspices of the BSG Building Integrity Project, which is led by Nick Kirby. So before we bring up Mihály, I just want to hand over to Nick for a few minutes to say a couple things about the project.
Thanks, Martin. So the Building Integrity Program is absolutely delighted to have Mihály along here today. Our program is the kind of epicenter for all work on corruption, integrity, and good governance within the Blavatnik School of Government. The Building Integrity Program, we try to define what it means for institutions to have integrity, investigate why it's important, how to build it, and we try to engage practitioners at a number of different levels. We have a little Twitter handle here at Integrity BSG, and if you'd like to know more about our program and what we're doing here, please get in contact. Without further ado, I'll leave it to you, Mihály.
Great, thanks a lot. Okay. Thank you very much for being here at this late hour. I hope I will be able to manage this. Yes, very good. So, you see some animations. So I'm going to talk about promoting good governance through digital tools, and I'm going to draw on a couple of research projects I have been doing partially at the University of Cambridge and in other places. Mainly the project called DIGIWHIST, which is an EU-funded project and went through 3 years of painful data collection of public procurement, administrative data collection, and indicator building, and you will see some of our results, but we are increasingly having global results from other countries and development funding, which I will touch upon in the second half of this presentation. This first part, we'll talk about the state of the art in digital government in public procurement. So that's a kind of overview of what we have, where we have gotten, what are our challenges, and what are our successes. And then I will talk about one particular project we are running together with some colleagues at the World Bank in Bangladesh, where we look at whether electronic tendering is actually promoting efficiency and good governance as we expect it from it. I will try not to be too long, something like 45 minutes, but please stop me way before that, before you fall asleep. The previous very good seminar, Cake and Corruption, I planned to talk for 10 minutes and ended up talking 48, but that's because most of it ended up being a discussion, so please feel free to interrupt me. So let's move on to the first part, the state of the art in digital government records in public contracts or public procurement. So what is really public procurement? What are we talking about? Public procurement, quite simply, is just anything the governments buy. So that's buying anything from a nuclear power plant to school meals in downtown London. So really, the diversity is enormous. It encompasses services, goods, and works as well. So really, there is a lot to look at. And this is not just very diverse, but it's also about something like 1/3 of government spending. So there is really a lot of money going into these systems, and if you want to understand what governments do, really public procurement is one of the major ways of understanding this. So this is just to show how much governments spend on procurement. This is one of those typical OECD figures which seem to be very informative, but actually they're hard to make sense of. I will try to help you a bit. You have the countries here right under each other. On the left-hand side, you have procurement as a share of GDP. On the right-hand side, you have procurement in terms of government expenditure. So the OECD average would be just under 30%, and then there would be quite a bit of diversity here, but really no government is below 25%. So like 1/4, 1/3 of government spending goes through public procurement. Netherlands is an extreme case where it's almost half of government spending goes through public procurement system. So really, if you want to understand whether a government is doing well or not, this is one of the major ways you have to look at, otherwise you're missing 1/3 or 1/4 of all of what governments do. Now, the second interesting point about public procurement is that digitalization and the digitalization agenda has been going on for over 20 years. And that's for two parts. First, on the administration side, there have been constant successive waves of digitizing the tendering process, the contract management, but also on the private side, there is online bidding, a lot of companies selling online tools for bidding companies. So really, digitization has been pushing for two different sides. So you would imagine this has had some major effects which we should be happy to see and as we expect. And you will see that not all is rosy as we expect. So this is just a kind of stylized fact. This is directly taken from a recent article in The Economist, which luckily used our DIGIWHIST data and our indicators. This is a couple of European countries, single bidding share, so the share of all contract awards for which there was no apparent competition, for which there was only one company submitting a bid. You see from 2006 to 2015, and then all of these lines are upward sloping. And this is not a small thing. This is quite major. For example, from Britain, moving from 5% to 10%, so something like doubling. But the story is very similar for Italy, just starting from a higher benchmark, so from 15% to 30%, right? So you would imagine we are digitalizing procurement, both public and the private side, lowering transaction costs, lowering the cost of information. Right? We would imagine that this would increase competition, this would broaden access to government tenders, hence more companies bidding, hence fewer tenders without any apparent competition. By the way, all procurement laws in these countries require open competition for these tenders for value for money and integrity reasons. Now, this competition is just getting worse. It's getting less and less. So this is our result, which is quite worrying and quite significant. There is another bit of evidence going to the same conclusion. This is a recent work I concluded for DG Regio of the European Commission. So that's the DG working on regional development. And they were interested in quality of government on the regional level using public procurement data. And then this measure of quality of governance on the regional level encompasses not just competition, which you've seen before, but looks at corruption risks, looks at transparency, and looks at administrative efficiency, such as the speed of concluding contracts. Now, what you have here is a comparison of the first 3 years, the last 3 years before the financial crisis, with the latest 3 years for which we have good quality data. And unfortunately, this map is by and large red, which means governance quality according to these different dimensions, as I mentioned, competition, transparency, efficiency. This governance quality has gone down quite significantly in most European regions. There are some exceptions in Eastern Europe in particular, but also some in the UK. So the picture, looking at a single indicator as well as a broad set of indicators, is very, very similar. Things are getting worse. In spite of our efforts, things are getting worse, and this is something I would like to explore a bit with you. Of course, the answer will not only be in the digitization agenda, but part of the answer will be in the incomplete digitization of public procurement in Europe. So the first, yes, happy that you're there.
About the trends, as opposed to the absolute level of good governance, and what if all the governance was really, really good in 2007 and it went down a little bit? Why do we care about the trends?
Oh, we care about the trends because that costs a lot of money. So if you have fewer companies bidding, you have higher prices. That costs a lot of money, and then probably we are trying to save money in the meantime. So that would be one of the reasons why you think moving from 15% single bidding to 30% single bidding is a bad thing, because that makes Italian public procurement a lot more expensive. And you can put a price tag on that. And quality is harder to measure, but I can assure you that quality also suffers from lack of competition.
Okay, so I got some, but then this is really just about costs. There's no other reason we should care.
No, well, I mean, I personally care for transparency for itself, right? I think it's good to inform public. I care for integrity because integrity on its own is a goal. I mentioned.
We care about the absolute level.
Just because of the online.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry, and I don't mean to stop you. You can just sort of say, I'll get back to that later. When you put up the change numbers without putting up the absolute numbers, I mean, I see Scandinavia looking problematic there, and I'm guessing if you put up the absolute numbers, it would look a lot better. And if you care about governance, you really care about what the absolute level is, and the trend is one way of getting to better absolute numbers.
Yes.
So I'm trying to understand your focus on change.
Yeah, yes, exactly. I also care about levels, and then if you go to the publication, you have quite a bit of discussion of the levels. And even though you have quite a bit of deterioration in Scandinavia, the level is way above Eastern European level. So I'm very much with you in that this is very important. I focus on the change because to me it was shocking. To me, first seeing, okay, things are getting that much worse, regardless whether you start from very high or very low, that was something I didn't expect at all. And I really tried to slice the data in different ways and see if there are some subsections which work differently, but this seems to be a consistent picture.
So just to clarify, is this... this is one set of years against another?
Yeah,
so
3 years against 3 years, yes.
How do we know this is not just a reflection of volatility? So that any particular year you're going to go up and down?
Yeah, there is.
Okay.
This is just one. By the way, single bidding is also a component in the broader score of governance quality. But yes, there is volatility. I pulled together 3 years in the beginning and the end of the time series to kind of get away from some of this volatility. But as I said, if I just took a trend, it would be a very similar picture. It's just harder to put it on a map if I have 15 years. Okay, I'm happy that we have some discussion already. So getting back to trying to explain what's happening and what are the digitization aspects of all this is looking at the data and the markets we are dealing with. First of all, digitization is incomplete in Europe in terms of the scope of the data we are talking about, the scope of the digitalization, the requirements and the tools, requirements of using digital tools in public procurement. I will have a few figures on that in a minute. The second, the depth of the data, so the scale of coverage of these digital tools, of transparency laws, in terms of knowing what's happening in the full process, in terms of conducting public procurement electronically, that is incomplete as well. And the quality of the data, to what degree we are following these laws, transparency laws in public procurement, and to what degree we are using these online tools as they are intended, that is also incomplete. And finally, the data for market analysis, for driving market decisions, that is hardly available, and there are serious questions about machine readability and availability of the data for analytics as well. So data scope, one aspect of this incomplete digitization is to what degree online tools have to be used in public procurement as a requirement. And these are reporting thresholds. These are thresholds for using online tools in the different countries in Europe, and these are contract values. So if you have a contract above these values in these countries, then you have to use the central government website, the central government IT system, and go through the processes in that system, which is also following the national procurement law. I mean, Portugal is at one end of this distribution, zero threshold, so anything you procure, you have to put it in the system, you have to go through that procurement system of the country, and then you have some other countries like Armenia, Georgia, very low threshold, so we see by and large most of what's happening, and most of it is going through electronic procurement tools. And on the other hand of the distribution, there is Netherlands, Germany, and Austria. So these are countries where the minimum application thresholds are very high. So anything below this 134,000 euros can be done on paper. You can just announce it on a piece of paper, you put it up on your municipality's bulletin or something you like. It's pretty much, you have discretion. So you can see that this scale is actually quite the opposite of what we are used to. Well-governed countries on the bad end of the distribution, so to say, and badly governed countries are on the good end of the distribution in terms of transparency. So this was a kind of surprising for us. But these thresholds also translate into the number of transactions, number of contracts captured in these online systems. I would like to highlight, for example, Portugal, which has something like 3 times more contracts passing through an electronic procurement system than Germany. And you know that the economic weight of these countries is quite the opposite. On their own, Poland, France, and Portugal account for most of electronic public procurement in Europe, because their systems are extensive, their thresholds are very low, and their also sectoral exceptions are very rare. So that is when, in Portugal or France or Poland, I see most of what's happening when I look at my data set, and I see very little when I look at Germany. The second aspect I mentioned, which was incomplete, is data depth. So to what degree the data I see, to what degree the data is produced by electronic procurement systems that covers the full set of public procurement activities. And one important aspect of electronic procurement is the stage at which electronic procurement stops, the stage at which electronic procurement is covered. And in most European countries, and there would be the light green countries, those countries where electronic procurement covers advertisement and contract award, but then there is nothing about contract implementation. So we sign a contract, we award a contract, that's great, but then we move back to paper for looking at deliveries, invoices, and all that. Then the dark green countries, then we have full tender cycle covered in the same IT system, the same public procurement system, so contract implementation is also there. I'm not saying that there is no IT system for contract payments and contract implementation in the brighter green countries. I'm just saying that is disconnected, and this is not linkable to the tendering part of the IT system. Last but not least, looking at data quality, to what degree requirements set out in the laws and also ingrained in the IT system we are using, to what degree these quality requirements are actually followed. And here you see very simple quality expectation, which is simply saying, okay, there are minimum reporting requirements. You have to put in basic information in these IT systems. So, for example, if you award a contract, you have to put in the system that this and this is the name of the company who has won the contract, or this is the contract value for which you awarded the contract. Right, so very basic things required by the law. They are mandatory fields also in the IT system. However, you see that there are quite some countries where there's a lot of missing information. So for example, Sweden, this bar goes up only almost until 30%. So that means if you look at an average Swedish contract award announcement, then 30%, something like 1/3 of mandatory fields will be empty, will be basically missing. Right? So you wouldn't know who has won the contract, you wouldn't know what's the contract value. And it's maybe some familiar picture now that countries which we tend to think as less well-governed, like Slovakia, Romania, or Hungary, there at least the missing rate is very, very low, so 2%, 3%. So at least there is some information to work with. I'm not claiming that this is correct information. I'm not claiming it makes sense. I'm just claiming that at least they follow the very basics of administration. There is a law, there is an IT system, and you feed the data which needs to go through that data system, right? So this, again, something very surprising for us. Any questions about this? Okay. Quite surprising. Okay, so why we did the DIGIWHIST project and why we was needed to spend 3 years on collecting data and making sense of all this. The problem was that these data sets these transparency laws require this data to be disclosed in websites. So a set of HTML pages or PDFs. So basically there is a law which tells you, okay, announce your contracts. So then you put up, for every single contract, you put up a website, kind of a page. Now this is all very nice. You can actually go and check each and the individual page. But if you want to say, ask a very basic analytical question, who are the biggest suppliers of the municipality of Berlin? Well, it's very hard to answer this question without having a database saying this is the name of the company, this is the ID of the company, this is the contract value, right? And that you need to arrive from individual web pages, millions of web pages, move to a structured database. And this is what we did. It was very painful, understanding the law, understanding the structure of these semi-structured text files and HTML files, and then create a database. So this is what our project has done under the name of data collection, like massive amounts of web scraping and data parsing and text mining. And we created a database for 32 European countries that is covering the national sources as well as the EU-wide sources. So that's the 17.5 million contracts, which I mentioned before. And then, since then, we started to move on with the same approach to other countries, such as the US federal contracts, which is slightly easier to access, still very messy. We have run a project with DFID on donor procurement, collecting similar data on World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, and Europe Aid contracts. And now we are working on, again, with DFID on a couple of developing countries, putting them in the very same structure, very same indicators, and releasing it in a one-click download format. So data can be accessed on opentender.eu, that's the Europe-wide website. And then there is the donor procurement data is on the Government Transparency Institute's website. And then further releases will come later this year and next year. So if you're interested in this data, please get in touch or ask questions now, because there is a lot, really a lot more than I can ever wish to analyze. So I would like to bring a couple of use cases, what you can do with this data once it's in a structured format, once you have a couple of performance indicators in it. I wanted to show you our Open Tender website, which unfortunately is not working for whatever firewall reasons, but I'm going to show you the very basics, at least from my slides. So this website is releasing these 17.5 million contracts for civil society and journalistic uses predominantly. So it's making the data available for simple visualizations, for download, as well as filtering through the different data sets. And the point is that this is super micro level, right? So we have contracts, individual transactions, we have organizations, we have regions, we have countries on top of that, right? So it really allows you to start from very high and drill down, or if you have a particular contract in mind, so you want to start from bottom, you can find that and then again explore the network around, organizational network around a single observation. It has quite a wide range of analytical tools in it. We have built quite a wide range of indicators. Some of it is very simple, simply just transparency, what I mentioned before, like missing fields or discrepancies in the data set. We also have corruption risk indicators, which I will mention very briefly later on. And we also have administrative capacity indicators, and looking at decision-making speed or looking at errors made during the process. Very, very basic indicators of administrative capacity. Now, you can download the full data set, or you can download just bits of the data which you have you selected for yourself, that you're interested in. And you can also do something very useful, I think, which is benchmarking. And the idea here is that you might find, okay, my municipality is spending money badly, right? Okay, there's no competition, prices are high, and they're always late, right? Is it something we can improve on, right? And that's why the benchmarking function is useful, because you can compare to similar municipalities in your geographical vicinity, and you say, hey, they can actually get 2 more bidders than you. They can have 3 days quicker decision making than you. So you can benchmark individual organizations against the group of similar organizations according to every single performance indicator. So this is where we try to create a positive cycle where learning is at the heart of the whole process rather than just naming and shaming of the best performance. So the analytical dashboards we have created are the following. We have basic market analytics. So if you are interested in who are the competitors on the market, say who are supplying electricity to regional governments, you can look at market overview, you can look at main buyers, main suppliers, and you can look at prices. Administrative capacity indicators is what I mentioned is a different dashboard. We are looking at how the administration itself is performing, so like decision-making speed or errors made in the process of procurement tenders. Then we have transparency indicators, which is very straightforward, basic indicators of transparency. Have you fulfilled the law? Have you followed the law? Have you published what needs to be published as a requirement? And then finally, we have corruption risk or integrity indicators, which look at seemingly deliberate biases in the tendering process, such as tailoring the tendering specifications to a particular company, or suspiciously missing bidders on a market which otherwise would be a competitive market. So we're trying to get at the risk of corruption risk. So this is something I cannot show, unfortunately, online, but you can have an overall score, for example, for administrative capacity, and then you can look at the components of it, and then this is same for integrity and corruption risk. And then because we are feeding on official government data, everything we do can be traced back to the official source, can be traced back to the individual contracts, individual tenders. So you have a table underlying, table of tenders and contracts underlying or scoring our indicators, and then if you click on them, you can actually find the URL leading back to the official government website. The second use case I wanted to show you is coming from Poland, and this is, I hope, is the future, but it can only be done in countries where data quality is very high, and the law is clear enough that you can actually write an algorithm for checking compliance with the law directly. So this is looking at whether tenders are misplaced, avoiding Europe-wide regulations. So how public procurement regulation is structured in Europe, there is the EU-wide regulation for high-value procurement, and there is national regulation below that. So then the question is if there is some gaming around these thresholds, because EU-wide regulations are a lot more stringent in terms of procedural rules. Also, you have to publish in English, you have to put up your call for tender on a EU-wide website, so a lot more companies will see it. So basically, if you want to avoid open competition, you might be motivated. Or if you want to avoid excessive bureaucratic burden, you might be motivated to go just under the threshold and avoid EU regulations and follow the national regulation. So the first thing we looked at is whether there is outright violation of regulations. What you see on the left-hand side, the dark green bars, these are the number of tenders coming from the national Polish portal. So the left-hand side from the contract value threshold. And then on the right-hand side, you see the brighter green bars. And these are coming from the EU-wide tenders electronic daily website. So these are tenders regulated by the EU directives. And you see that there is a couple of dark green bars on the right-hand side. So those are tenders which by law, by their contract value, they should be placed on the TED website, but they are on the national website, right? So those are outright violating the law. They have the contract value, which would mean they go on the EU-wide website, but actually they show up only in the national website following the national rules, right? So that is one thing when really just outright violating the law. It might be that they don't know that the rules apply. They might just ignore the rules, or might be deliberately placing the tenders on a different website. Now, the second form of gaming is when you manipulate contract values, because thresholds are set for contract values. And what you see here is the threshold for the EU-regulated tenders and the national tenders. What can be seen immediately is that from the right-hand side of the threshold, there's a quick drop in the number of tenders, very visible. At the same time, there is a spike just under the threshold, right? So that's very consistent with the gaming logic, because you would imagine the tenders to have a kind of downward sloping distribution according to that contract value. What made us even more suspicious is that every other year the threshold is updated with inflation, so moving from 190,000 to 200,000, and the spike moves just the very same year. So very, very straightforward. There are, of course, more sophisticated ways of gaming this system, but it does look like you can write a relatively straightforward algorithm trying to look for outright violations of the law and also likely violations of these contract value-based regulations. Now, let's say we find likely cases of violation. Does this matter, right? That's the question. Is it just a bit of laziness? We should ignore it. I mean, that's fine. We should give bureaucrats the freedom to choose which laws they apply. And then you look at some outcome variables, whether placing a tender on one website has an effect as opposed to placing the tender on another website, following one set of rules versus the other set of rules. One of the outcome indicators we looked at was single bidding, so share of awarded contracts with only one company bidding. And then this is the same logic. You have the threshold, and from the left-hand side to the threshold, you have a significantly higher single bidding share. On the right-hand side, you have significantly lower. So it does look like that placing a tender on an EU-wide portal, at least the summary being in English, has an effect. More companies show up. So that's good news for the EU and bad news for those Polish bureaucrats who actually try to avoid these regulations. And a final example of application, this is a project we have done with the European Investment Bank. The auditors of the bank, they wanted to know which recipients, which counterparts to audit on the basis of high corruption risk. We have developed in the DIGIWHIST project a set of red flags, such as single bidding on competitive markets, tailored specifications, or direct contracting where open contracting should be used, or company supplier registered in a tax haven, and so on and so forth. And what we did here, we simply plotted for them the distribution of beneficiaries of EIB loans according to the average share or average score of red flags they have in their contracting activity. So this is a figure based on something like 300,000 contracts. And you see that you have a group of organizations, typically public bodies, receiving EIB loans, which have a score of 0.6, 0.8, which means out of the 12 red flags we tracked for these organizations, 60%, 80% of these red flags is always present in their contracting activity. Yeah.
How does this distribution compare to the overall distribution of organizations? Or is the EIB sort of targeting more risky organizations or less risky?
To our surprise, this very much resembles the total distribution of organizations. So I guess they are blind. I mean, when I ask them, so how do you risk score organizations? Like, they didn't have hard evidence on this, and anyways, they cannot really refuse a municipality of Bucharest just because they think it's high risk, right? Because this is operating on a different logic. But they can target their audit activity based on the red flags. And the good news is that I don't just tell them, believe me, this is my scoring, right? I give them all the list of the contracts. I can give every single red flag, and if say, well, actually, tax haven registration of a supplier is not something we believe in. You can remove it, right? You can change your scoring, or you can decrease its weights within the overall composite score. So really, if you're an auditor, this is something you want to see, knowing who are the organizations, knowing how much they spend, and what are the risks they are engaged in, and what is the nature of those risks. And really, oh, there is a list of contracts. Here you go, you can go and check out every single one of them. This is taken from a paper from a couple of years ago, where we tried to look at, okay, we can look at red flags of individual organizations, we can look at red flags of individual contracts, but how does this look like when we pull it together into a single network? And then what you see here is dots representing either a supplier or a buyer, and the ties between the nodes representing contractual relationship between them. The size of these nodes represent the average share of different red flags I mentioned before, such as single bidding or tax haven registration of suppliers. And basically, what was shocking on this figure, and that this is Hungary just after the Fidesz government came into power, is that there is one giant network of high-risk organizations. So how this figure came to being was removing all organizations which we labeled as clean, who by and large contract competitively, by and large look like following the rules. And then the remaining network we assumed would be disconnected, different patches of corruption. Instead, what we found, one single powerful cluster of corruption and very little disconnected periphery on the side. And this is where, if you're an auditor, and this is interesting for EIB, what do you do? I mean, you remove one, the network remains intact, right? How do you fight corruption when it has been systematized to the degree that basically it's a densely connected network of high corruption risk organizations? So this is where individual action is kind of hopeless, right? You need systemic shock to the whole public sector to change anything. I'm moving on to the second part, which is called part 4. Yeah.
Sorry, one question about that. I guess you haven't been able to do this for other countries because of data, but speculatively, do you think you would find this pattern in other countries as well?
Actually, we have been doing this for quite a few countries. Like there was demand for it in Latin America, like Peru and Brazil, and this has very different pictures. I mean, this is basically the anatomy of how corruption is organized. It's not the quantity of it, but what is this? How clustered it is, how centralized it is. And also this has over time dynamics. So what we found in this paper for Hungary is that overall corruption has not increased drastically with the Fidesz government. Its centralization increased. So this picture for before the right-wing government, some of you might know Hungarian politics. So before this highly centralized party came into power, it was really distinct sub-centers, clusters, relatively disconnected from each other. And then the government came into power, not just the party was centralized, but corruption became centralized as well. So this is where we start getting into the question how corruption is organized, not just how much of it there is.
So could you also look cross-country but at particular sectors?
Sorry?
Like, could you also look cross-country but at sectors?
Yes. Definitely.
Like certain kinds of services or certain sorts of construction and so on?
We haven't done that, but yes, we have all the data for it. I mean, every single contract in this figure would have a detailed sectoral label to it, so down to the level of potato or used nuclear fuel, like this very detailed product categorization. So in principle, you can just slice it up by say, I'm interested in specialized legal services, and then just draw the network. We are doing right now a defense study looking at these networks across all the major defense spenders in Europe, UK, France, Italy, Poland, and a couple of other countries, and looking at defense networks only. Shall I move on? Okay, still have 10 minutes. So I will try to address part 2, which is part 4 right now, which is about our ongoing research project with the World Bank. It's about introducing electronic government procurement or public procurement in Bangladesh and testing the impact of this new system on economy, administrative efficiency, and open access, or if you like, anti-corruption. So this is moving from a fully paper-based system to a very advanced electronic system. So this is a unique opportunity because most countries tend to go gradually, just do a bit of electronic here and then largely on paper. But Bangladesh, thanks to the World Bank's push, actually moved from fully paper to a very advanced electronic system. We have three main components to this study. One is an observational retrospective study on introducing electronic bidding and bid evaluation. And then we have two randomized control trials, one running on electronic contract management. So after contract award, what's happening, and if you manage contract implementation electronically, what's the effect of that? And then we have citizen engagement, so running citizen monitoring portals using electronic data and how that changes public procurement outcomes. So this is done with two colleagues from the World Bank. I'm going to talk about the initial results of the observational study because the RCTs are running and I don't have enough data to show anything interesting for you right now. So a couple of hypotheses around electronic public procurement which might be relevant. There is a lot more, but these are some which we can quickly explore in a short presentation. So the first one is electronic public procurement would reduce barriers to entry. Transaction costs are lower. You can prepare your bids electronically. Information costs are lower. You can know about the bidding opportunity much easier. It's basically costless. Just go to a website. So this is fairly straightforward. Any economic theory would predict that. The second thing, which again very widely expected, is that electronic procurement would increase administrative efficiencies. Basically, you don't need to post things around, and signatures just take 1 second, and the process, anyways, is very streamlined. A lot of you don't need to copy things from one paper to another because they automatically filled in. So really, you would expect administrative efficiency to work in one direction. However, this is by far not given, right? This is a hypothesis. It might be that electronic literacy, IT literacy is low, so that actually these benefits don't arise, or it can be that people don't know how to use this system and they just get lost in them. They fill in different fields where information should go somewhere else. So really, this is not guaranteed that in a developing country like Bangladesh, a complex, very highly developed, detailed public procurement, electronic public procurement system would have these benefits. The second set of hypotheses are very interesting for us because it's becoming a hip topic in corruption research, which is displacement effects. I don't know if you have read, there was a recent paper in Nature on displacement effects in anti-corruption in particular. And then this is actually very worrying because we might be able to fight corruption in one very narrowly defined field. We have a beautiful RCT, everything works, but then other things we don't measure, right? And then just corruption just moves on because especially in fields of high-level corruption, political corruption, these are really resourceful groups which strategically respond to anti-corruption efforts. So we really shouldn't assume that just because we managed to clean up one small part of the administration, then the corruption overall decreased. So we have heard about displacement effects. And the corresponding hypotheses are that electronic procurement improves access, so decreases corruption risk in the stages of the procurement process which are electronically administered. So that would be bidding and bid evaluation. But then corruption increases as a result in the not monitored part, so that is a contract implementation. So here we have a setup comparing electronic procurement in the first two phases with electronic procurement with all three phases covered by electronic tools. The second interesting hypothesis is that there is also a spillover effect from manually administered tenders to electronically administrative tenders. So you still keep on doing a small portion of small value procurement contracts on paper, whereas the rest goes on electronic. So basically what's rational from a corrupt group is to concentrate rent seeking on less tightly monitored electronic manual tenders. And then this nicely feeds back into the incomplete digitization of the European public procurement system. We had many examples of not the whole cycle of procurement being covered by European procurement systems, also having a lot of low-value contracts which are still done on paper. So really, this is a developing country. This is a very different setup from the European examples we have seen, but there is actually, at least on very high level, there are potential learning across the cases. There's very little time, so I'm basically just going to talk about the data I'm going to present for this part of the presentation. So we have a survey of manual paper-based records. So it's a very horrible word, but you know, people go to archives at the back of the cellar, take it out, and manually copy things into a spreadsheet for us, and then we compare that with electronic records in the IT system, which is already running. And in parallel, we are running a public buyer procuring entity survey. So that's a civil servant survey using the World Bank's Bureaucracy Lab survey, which covers skills, motivation, and a couple of standard civil service questions. So what is our evaluation design and what are our worries? Our main challenge with the retrospective study, so that's not the RCT, this is the retrospective study, is self-selection. So procuring entities self-select into whether they want to start with electronic procurement or not. And they can also self-select the tenders they pass through electronic procurement or manual tenders. In addition, we can expect peer effects or spillover effects. So just because there is, like, say, 60% electronic procurement in a buyer and 40% manual, it doesn't mean that we can separate the two systems. Maybe attention is split in a different way, so there's a spillover from electronic, more tightly monitored tenders to manual tenders, and there is less attention. So as a solution, we use something which is called partial population design, where you look at the treatment saturation on the cluster level, on the procuring entity level, and you take this as one of the predictors of your model, and you try to see at different saturation levels what is the effect of the treatment on individual contracts. We said for this analysis, we said the saturation levels is very high, so practically only electronic procurement within a supplier, within a procuring entity, and set it also very low in the control group, which is less than 30%. So kind of try to limit the within procuring entity spillover effects. There will be two sets of interactions I will show, which will be about the bureaucrat's motivation and the bureaucrat's competence. So these are two things you would imagine interacting with electronic procurement. Incompetent bureaucrats or less motivated bureaucrats might use the IT system very differently than their more motivated, more competent counterparts. So visually, this is how the experimental setup is done, and the two main effects we are interested in. Two effects we are interested in. The main effect, the ITT, is between treated tenders in high saturation organizations compared to those non-treated tenders which are in low saturation procuring entities. So pure control versus pure treated. And there is the in-between, the non-treated tenders in treated organizations. Right? So that's where you would try to get a sense of the spillover effect. Am I going too quick, or you are still with me? Okay, very good. So results, very quickly, ITT main effects. First, looking at administrative efficiency. We have electronic procurement versus manual, and then one of the outcome variable is the period, the length in terms of days for making decisions, so evaluating tenders. And this is on the, going back here, looking at the pure control and pure treated, and this is a matched sample. So basically, we are matching on baseline characteristics of the buyers. So we're looking at the same kind of buyer set before the whole experiment, treatment started. So this is something what we would expect, the very similar picture for signature periods, so signing contracts. And this is where it becomes interesting. When you look at effect as a function, so interacted with a civil servant motivation. Sorry?
How do you measure civil servant motivation?
So this is the survey of civil servants.
And they say, I'm very unmotivated, someone
Yes, something like that. Yes, where there's clearly measurement error in this. But we measure basically two things. One is changes over time, how you perceive your job satisfaction, and also your level of job satisfaction and your motivation to serve the public. There is conformity bias and all this, what you would imagine in these surveys. I'm with you on that for sure. Anyways, the interaction seems to be very interesting, and this picture is actually replicates itself with other outcome variables as well. So the most highly motivated part of the civil service, for the most highly motivated part of the civil service, the effect size is much closer to 0. So basically, whether you do electronic or on paper, but you are very highly motivated, there is little difference because the outcomes were anyways better. So you did actually quite well on paper. And the most of the effect comes for the lower end of the distribution, the lower motivated civil servants. This is where there is a major improvement in terms of speed. So this is drop in signature period length, so quicker signature of contracts. Moving on to open access or open competition integrity. One outcome is single bidder, so the share of single bidder contracts. This goes down from something like 15% to 8%. So that is quite significant, and it's very important in a country where effective physical violence has been used on paper-based tenders for deterring tenders if they were not connected to the buyer before. This is another interaction looking at, again, staff motivation and looking at another outcome, which is non-local winners. So we would think that competition is more open if not just if suppliers not only come from the local region or district, but also from other districts. And you see that for low motivation civil service, the effect is huge, and then for the high motivation, the effect is insignificant. So the picture is, again, very similar.
Sorry,
yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about endogeneity here and selection into which organizations have high saturation of treatment?
So because this is not an RCT, I cannot give you a fully satisfying answer. Basically, we have a very detailed matching strategy where we match both organization level, procuring entity level characteristics, as well as contract level characteristics. So on the match sample, we compare treatment and control contracts from buyers which had pretty much the same outcome variable before the treatment. So they had the same starting non-local winner share. We compare contracts from periods with the same experience of e-procurement. So the number of years an organization is using e-procurement, because you would think that there is a very steep learning curve, right? So these are the main organization level characteristics we match on, and there are contract level characteristics we match on, which is procedure type, contract value, and the main market. It's not perfect. It's a matching estimator. Because we have a good baseline measure, it's as good as it gets without an RCT. Yeah.
So it's matching with diff and diff, or it's just cross-sectional matching?
It's just cross-sectional matching, yeah. Yeah, I was playing with diff and diff yesterday, but didn't get to anything conclusive, so I didn't want to present. So this is work in progress, right? So this is not even the full manual sample is corrected. So yeah, if you have ideas on diff and diff, I'm happy to learn. Yeah, okay, and the final outcome, and I'm not taking any more time, is improve economy or economy of spending. One widely used indicator is the winning rebate or the % discounts companies give compared to the reference price. In the manual system, these tended to be negative, so meaning companies bid over the reference price. And then this became positive, so companies giving discounts in the electronic procurement system. The other interaction I mentioned was with skills. It's in particular IT skills, self-reported again, but at least having a sense of how well bureaucrats think they have IT skills and general understanding of the procurement process. And then you see that as skills increase, the manual tender basically have more or less the same outcome in terms of winning rebate, close to zero. And then basically e-procurement enhances outcomes, so improves outcomes as skills improve. So basically you give a nice tool to those who can work with it. And that is where the effect, the average effect observed here is basically produced by the high skills public administration. So very interesting motivation and skills having an opposite interaction effect. Yes, and then this is work in progress. As I said, I'm happy to hear comments, and thank you for your attention.
Great. Thanks, Mishi, for a really great talk. For anyone who's tried to work with government data on procurement and this kind of thing before, you'll know how impressive all of this is and how much of a pain in the butt it all would have been to do. So congratulations on that. Let's open up for questions. We'll probably take 3 questions at a time, and then we can answer them all together. We've got one here. Anyone else?
Hi. Hello. Can you, yep, that's working. Hi. That's been absolutely fascinating. I've thoroughly enjoyed the presentation. I actually come from practice where I spend most of my time designing and implementing and running procurement processes on behalf of eligible bodies. And there's so many of your slides that I can hear the conversations taking place. You know, if we price it at this level, does that mean we have to go to full ODU? What are our alternatives? And I can hear the lawyers in a room talking about risk. And so it's fascinating to see the data of all those conversations that I've experienced over time. I've got lots and lots of questions, but something that occurs to me is obviously there are shades of procurement and there are different methodologies within e-procurement. You have, recently, and a lot of the work I do is navigating the difference between competitive procedure with negotiation versus competitive dialogue and the implications it has on cost and time and program. And does your data set allow you to kind of break down the contract splicing depending on the routes that people are then electing to take? And are you seeing actually is your data potentially a rational response to the complexities that accumulate as contract prices get larger? There is a motivation on the procuring entity to become innovative. Is one of my questions, and is this a rational response, or is it corruption? And then the other question is there's and linked to that, you talk about competition getting worse, the greater prevalence of single tenders over time. Are we seeing the market getting better at predicting their chances? So not only are we seeing potentially the procuring authorities getting better at working the system, as it were, to be polite to them, are you also seeing the market getting more selective about how it engages? Are you able to give any insights into that?
Mm-hmm. Great. Why don't we just start by taking those 2, and we can go back to the audience.
Okay, good. I'm very happy that you have your memories in your head, listening to my slides. It's always great to hear practitioners, and then it made sense what I said. That's good feedback. So on procedure type, yes, so we have very detailed procedure type variables in the data, such as framework agreements, first stage, second stage. We have also procedure type in terms of direct contracting, open competition, or various versions you have, say. So definitely you can slice up the data by these variables, and they very much predict a lot of outcomes, right? So direct contracting, you really do get one company, and open competition, you tend to have more companies. So in that sense, in most contexts, procedure types are used as intended. And this is really just with most contexts. And one of the most striking things is to see how procedure type in one country is used very differently from another country. So in most Eastern European countries, for example, and actually there's a very good paper on this, if you have a negotiated procedure without prior publication, this means you don't advertise, you negotiate it with your cronies, and this equals corruption. I mean, really, this is as how people take it. And if you look at the very same procedure in Denmark, you have more bidders than an open tender. Because when the Danish administration negotiates with the selected suppliers, they do a market analysis before, and they go for those 5, 6 organizations they think could deliver, and negotiation is done according to the rules. So really, the very same procedure could work very differently based on the starting integrity of the public administration that it uses. In terms of rational response, I mean, we have all sorts of responses, right? We're talking about millions of tenders. We have very nonsensical framework agreements for very unique construction tenders, which Hungary tries to get away with for a couple of years, right? You have very fragmented framework agreements. I think that's an example from Brazil. I'm going next week to Brazil, telling to the federal government that their framework agreements make no sense. They allow every single buyer to run its own framework agreement. The very point of a framework agreement is the aggregate demand. You have economies of scale for standardized goods. You have leverage. You can push down prices and improve on quality, right? If you allow 10 framework agreements for the very same product, then what's the point of running a framework agreement? So we have all sorts of strange things in this data. And surprisingly different uses of the very same tool. I don't know if that answers your question, maybe just loosely, but happy to continue this conversation. And in terms of single bidding, really I just put it up as a puzzle. I have no clear answer. I intend to answer that question in the years coming. I think part of this deteriorating situation is part of it is due to austerity, firing public procurement officials, right? They're lowering their motivation, that kind of thing. The other part, whether suppliers better in predicting the market, I don't know. I really don't know if that is the case. There might be something to do with market entry rates, whether new companies try their luck or really just the usual guys remain in the market. And that again goes back to the financial crisis and a lot of companies going bust. So if there are fewer companies on the market because some went bust and there is harder access to credit, banks don't give money to you because you just want to enter a new market, then entry rates will be down, and then again, single bidding might be much higher. But really, I'm just speculating. So if you have ideas, I'm happy to try them out later in the data, because I think it's a big puzzle, because the effect is, the trend is very marked.
Great. Question here. Any other questions while I'm collecting? Good.
Yeah.
So thanks for the talk, which was extremely interesting and wide-ranging. So I have two questions. The first is, I don't understand the answer to the question that you posed at the beginning about why have things got worse. There was an answer for, or at least there was a suggestion of an answer for Hungary, which is there's this sort of centralized network that Fidesz has created, and it's not decentralized, it's becoming more and more clustered, and therefore it's harder to break up. Maybe that was an answer, but I'm not sure what your general answer to your question was about the sort of getting worse. It came out a little bit in your response to these questions, but not so much from the data. So is the justification that we need the data so that we can answer the question, or did I miss the answer? So that's the first question. Which is really just an informational question, trying to understand where this this huge, impressive exercise leads to in sort of answering the big questions about how governance is doing, both in terms of trends and levels, as we talked about at the beginning. And my second question is really much more speculative, and it is, given what you've learned about what e-procurement does for the quality of government, what might we expect the penetration of digital government techniques in other areas of government outside of procurement to do? And how would we think about that? Should we think most about the skill interactions? Should we think about the interactions with motivation? Or is there some other way of thinking about it? So this is asking you to think about something that you haven't done yet, based on what you have done.
Can I suggest that you take those two meaty questions together before we move on?
Yeah, these questions make up for 4 or 5, I guess. Yeah. No, so answering your first question, so why things has gotten worse, this is an inspirational question. I don't have a full answer to it, so you completely got it right. I tried to allude to some answers, but it's really just a recent observation. This working paper I quoted is 3 or 4 months old. So really it is a driving dilemma question. I think it's worth discussing, and also it will drive my interest as moving forward. However, and I'm sorry that this was not clear, one bit of the answer is something to do with the incomplete digitization of procurement. It doesn't explain why things are getting worse, but it does explain that does suggest that we are not reaping full benefit of digitization. And that's where the Bangladesh part with the European part goes very well together. So if we know that digitizing the full process has a lot higher payoff than digitizing half of it, then seeing that other than 4 countries out of 35 digitized half of it, then, well, this should be a problem. We should be worried about it, right? This is, getting at one bit of the answer. I mentioned, austerity. I mentioned company going bust. These are hypotheses, so I have no answers. But I think it's definitely worth to look into. Now, other areas, I think, speculating, right? So I think both what you mentioned, the motivation interaction and the skill interaction, those are both lessons which may well be true in other areas of digital government. And I also want to go back to my answer to your first question, which is incomplete digitization might not lead to the expected benefit at all, or just a lot less than what we imagine to have. So having part of a process electronic and then moving back to paper, that is unacceptable in many ways, and I hope that the Bangladesh study will show this very nicely with the procurement field. So in that sense, there are learnings, and then also in terms of how far these lessons travel. And I think it's very straightforward to extrapolate from procurement to other bidding markets, selling public assets, or you would consider public sector jobs as a bidding market, right? There is a call, people apply, there might be competition, there are selection criteria, some of it might be digitized, some of it might not, right? So I think the lesson drawn from procurement very neatly travel to similarly structured markets or government activities, right? The auctions and bidding markets. I'm much more worried about making inferences to very different aspects, say, benefit administration or other aspects or lawmaking in the parliament. So that would be very briefly.
Great, thank you. Nick?
Just 2 quick questions.
Again,
Are we
right?
operational? Was there a single country which didn't have the single bidder trend? Or they all are about 2 times over the same period? And secondly, at one point you said, here's a number of graphs where we seem to have, quote unquote, the good countries at the opposite end to where we expected. Yeah. And you said, this is my problem. And I was like, wow, I can't wait for the solution. And I'm not sure if I missed it, but was this another one of these grand questions which the whole project's going to deliver on, or do you have some starter answers on that? Thanks.
questions we want to collect? Okay, so I have a moderator's privilege question to, although I guess it's not privilege if I do it at the end. But anyway, I have a question.
I will try to answer, okay?
Okay, great. So IT projects in government are kind of notoriously hard to implement and often go very badly. And so I'd be kind of curious to hear you talk a little bit about the implementation of these kind of digital procurement systems, and either with respect to things that you've worked on directly as part of this project, or the kind of the literature or the experience on it more generally.
Okay, so these are the last three questions. Mm-hmm. So yes, there are both regions and countries where the trend is either flat or there is some improvement. I mean, I won't go back to the map, but if you look at the regional map, I mean, some Eastern European regions manage to improve. They start from a very, very bad level, but compared to themselves, they manage to improve moderately.
A number in the UK as well.
Yeah, exactly. There were some parts of UK outside of the core London and the urban areas, which is very, very interesting. Again, just as a question mark. So, yes, this is, and I don't expect one grand theory explaining, because what's happening in Poland, it's a very different experience throughout the crisis than English countryside, right? I mean, these stories might be very, very different. Just because I can put them on a single scale doesn't mean that we can explain them within one framework. But yes, that is definitely there. So your second question was about the good countries having very bad.
Yeah, I think it was a number of graphs, but one was
the quality of data. Yeah, exactly. So I think that graph, and then kind of comparing what I see and then what the broader theory would predict, I think is just teaches humility, that we come with this open data movement and central websites and web scraping and all that kind of expectations, but actually Sweden has worked without these for something like 200 years now, right? So me saying Swedish data is crap, and as a result, it is high corruption, this would be wrong. However, and then we have a paper on Swedish local level corruption risk, saying, okay, Sweden has meritocratic bureaucracy, very well, relatively well funded. We have active civil society, local media, all the things which we call as very important in anti-corruption. It has this. And given this, you have bad procurement data, low transparency. Does this still harm your corruption performance? I mean, that's the question, right? It's just comparing, Romania with Sweden in this context wouldn't help you much, because it would mean that actually Sweden is more corrupt than Romania. Well, that's not the case. But within the Swedish context, those municipalities which tend to be more transparent, they have better outcomes as well. So what the learning here is that.
You have shown that.
So yeah, we have a paper on that. It's a Swedish local procurement corruption, yeah. And the story here is that you have an ecosystem of anti-corruption, and data and transparency and open bidding is really just a tiny portion of it. So I cannot say just because of that graph then, turn everything inside out. However, I can say given these other instruments which work, it still costs Sweden not to be as transparent as Romania in procurement. So my benchmark works. So advertising on an EU-wide platform means you get more bidders, and that usually is a good thing. And the Swedes would tell me, no, but we advertise locally, and those 3 local firms are good. Well, I say, you went to the same high school with them, so I'm not sure, right? So there would be different stories back and forth, and there are different levels of transparency and different levels of openness. And I think this is just like a discussion we can have based on the data. And as I said, humility, that this is really just a portion of the whole anti-corruption ecosystem. In terms of IT project implementation, I think what is very interesting happening in this space right now is open source software and open source data standards gaining speed. And then just a few months ago, the European Commission put out a call for basically putting money for member states moving fully open source in terms of managing their tenders, in terms of the data standard and sharing the data. So I think what is interesting in this space is that we had these usual failures of IT systems, not just of complexity and late delivery, but also supplier capture. So the Oracle and the big IT companies would hold on to the source code, hold on to the standards, and if you want to just tweak a small thing, the governments would have to pay huge sums. So really, a lot of governments were not in control of their own data. And now there is a significant move that governments understand that they want the data for their, competition authority wants this data, or the treasury wants this data, and then they want to be able to use it, and they move fully open source and open data standard fully. And this is a game changer in this field, and I think that is again similar to other fields.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, please join me again in thanking Mihály for a really fascinating talk. And if you have any other questions, I'm sure he's happy to stay behind and chat for a few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much.